as we said, many things have changed since last year when we met. And really, in many ways, historical things happened. We had two assassination attempts of one of the candidates, of Donald Trump. The last was just a few days ago. Change in the candidate. We now have Kamala Harris running. She surprised most people by performing quite well in the debate. So we have seen also the debate. And yet, the latest poll show that the situation is still pretty much even. There was a New York Times poll, I think, that came out today that showed that on a national basis, the two candidates are more or less at 47% each. Other polls show Harris on the popular vote, which, of course, we know doesn't really count. What counts is the state. And in Pennsylvania, the polls of this morning seem to be having Kamala Harris a little bit ahead. But the states are Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, North Dakota, Nevada, North Carolina. So those are the ones where the election will be determined. Is that right?
Not North Dakota, I think.
No, South Dakota.
No. North Carolina, Georgia,
Georgia,
Arizona, and Nevada. Yeah.
Georgia. Thank you.
And I'm told it's correct. I'm always told.
Thank you. Otherwise,
Your
fake news would have been all around.
Your pronunciation is correct. I'm always told by Nevadans that it's pronounced Nevada, not Nevada, not Nevada. So yes. Well, first of all, thanks very much indeed for inviting me back, Murray. As you know, I'm a huge Italophile. As an Englishman as well as an American, I love everything about.
Excuse me. So, I'd like to point out, you probably don't see it very well, but the tie of Gerry that features a lovely Italian flag. So please give him an applause for that.
Tante grazie. I'm a big Italophile, but as an Englishman as well as an American, I'm an Italophile in everything except, I should say, soccer, calcio, and of course, Italy always managed to beat England at soccer, so that's a source of some grief for me, but joy, obviously, for Mario. But it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you again. It's always fun to be with you, Mario, in particular. I mean, to switch languages for a moment, you say everything has changed in the last year, but sort of, as the French say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. We've had this extraordinary year, former president being convicted, which you didn't mention, on multiple charges. Presidential debate, which led to the dropping out of the president himself from the race. His substitute with a candidate who'd never actually been a primary candidate this year, never actually won a vote in a primary election as the Democratic candidate. 2 assassination attempts, extraordinary turmoil and volatility and unpredictability that we've had over the last year, and things are just about the same in terms of the unpredictability of the outcome as they were a year ago. The 2 candidates, exactly as you say, Mario, are neck and neck in the national opinion polls. Harris may have a slight lead, depending which polls you want to look at. Trump seems to have a very slight advantage in those overall in those seven states that are going to be going to prove to be the outcome. I know you'll have lots of questions, but just to set the sort of frame for the discussion, I do think this is an election about change. I think, again, don't ask me who's going to win the election. I mean, as I said, I was just one of the reasons I'm wearing this tie is I was recently at the Ambrosetti event at Villa d'Este on Lake Como. And, I said, the Nikita Khrushchev, the former Soviet leader, was apparently once asked what he thought was the key difference between the sort of Soviet system and the Western system, and he said, the real problem with free elections that you have in the West is you never know who's going to win. And I said, well, actually, so what we do now in America, we've taken that a stage further. Not only do we not know who's going to win the election before we have the election, we don't know who's won the election even after the election has taken place. And I think that's probably going to be the case, I'm sorry to say, yet again. But I think, in terms of understanding what I think will determine the outcome in terms of the votes of those critical swing voters in those critical swing states who will determine the outcome. If you don't live in any of those states, 7 states, you can happily go away for the next 2 months and your vote won't have any impact anyway. But in those 7 states, the swing voters, I think it's a change. It's about change. All of the polling suggests that Americans are very unhappy with the status quo. They are very unhappy with the state of the country. You get consistent majorities in opinion polls when people are asked if the country's on the right track or the wrong track. more than 2/3 of voters say the country's on the wrong track. They don't like the Biden administration. He gets an approval rating of a little bit higher actually in the last month or so, but still about 40%. That's the kind of territory that normally leads to a landslide against the incumbent party, the sort that Jimmy Carter had in 1980. These are usually 1992 when George H.W. Bush lost, when Donald Trump lost in 2020. So those kind of numbers you would expect to see the incumbent lose. But of course, there isn't an incumbent, strictly speaking, not the incumbent president since Biden dropped out. And I think this is what makes the election so interesting and so unpredictable, is that the question for voters is, who is the change candidate? Who is actually going to represent the change? Kamala Harris is going out of her way to kind of claim to have the mantle of change, claim to be something new and fresh and different. She's kind of, distancing herself from the Biden administration, of which obviously she's been a key part for the last 4 years. I can sort of sometimes say it's like she says, she's asked about Joe Biden. She says, Joe Biden, no, I don't know, the name's familiar, but I don't really think, I don't think I've heard of him. Know nothing about him, had nothing to do with him for the last 4 years. So she's doing a reasonable job so far of making herself seem fresh, because she hasn't been the president, and at the same time making Donald Trump seem like the problem, making Donald Trump seem like the incumbent almost. That he's, she talks about the desire to turn the page, and she's not talking, she's kind of implicitly talking about Joe Biden, but she's explicitly talking about Donald Trump too. And so I think the reason the election is closer, but it has a lot to do with the personality and character of Donald Trump, which is very unappealing to many, many people. But I think it's also because in this battle to be the candidate of change, Harris is so far doing a reasonable job of presenting herself as a change. To say that the way, just to summarize, and I'll let you have your next question, but I'd say the election it's a strange election because it's an election between an incumbent who's trying to pretend not to be an incumbent against a candidate who is the former incumbent, who thinks he should still be the incumbent, but who is now trying not to pose as the incumbent. So it's all about how can you run away from being the incumbent and how can you best appeal to people on the basis of offering change.
Thank you. So, going back to the incumbent, non-incumbent Donald Trump. So we saw in the debate, he showed some limits. I'd like to have your impression about how he performed on the debate. He talked about dogs and cats being eaten by Haitian in a small town in Ohio, and which was not true, and that generated a whole debate around it. And he showed other, he was obsessed with immigration. He kept talking about immigration, trying to scare people about immigration and so on and so forth. So, do you think he's fit to be president?
I will answer that question. But in terms of the debate, I think, look, I don't think any question anybody who watched that debate will form the conclusion that Donald Trump's performance in the debate, I thought, was exactly like his performance in almost every other debate that he's ever done. And he's kind of lost the debate every time he's done it, whether against Hillary Clinton in 2016, Biden in 2020. He kind of won the debate against Biden in 2024 because Biden lost it, but there was nothing to do with Trump. Trump is undisciplined, doesn't prepare, wanders off into weird kind of extraneous issues, says outrageous things like dogs and cat stuff. But that was kind of standard Donald Trump fare. I thought Kamala Harris, on whom the pressure was greater, I think, probably did a better job than I think she benefited from the soft bigotry of low expectations, to quote former President George W. Bush. And she exceeded those expectations. She was competently prepared. She works on her remarks. She was able to deliver them effectively. She was enabled to avoid answering any questions by a couple of moderators who I thought were extremely biased. But there's no question that she had a better debate than Trump did. But what's interesting is that you haven't seen really any significant change in the polls since then. 70 million people supposedly watched that debate, and that's obviously not including all the people who would have seen the various clips, particularly I'm sure the dogs and cats in Springfield, Ohio, clips that circulated in the next day or two. But it's interesting that, again, I think part of the reason for that is, firstly, Americans are so polarized, and their political opinions are so ossified, and they are so completely steadfast in their support that, frankly, someone could stand up there and sort of, speak in a kind of weird foreign language for an hour and a half, and they still would only lose 1 or 2 points in the opinion polls. So I think there's an element of that. I do think the other thing is, and this is where I'm coming, I think that as terrible as Trump's performance was, and particularly as kind of mendacious and unreasonable as it was, particularly on the issue of that famous dogs and cats in Springfield thing, there is something. Trump, it was interesting that by focusing on that, and by that getting the attention that it got, he was able to keep what is a key issue for Republicans, immigration, front and center. And that was the dominant theme. People don't like the massive inflows of immigration we've seen in this country in the last 4 years in particular. And I think in a funny way, he probably kind of, as bad as that was, what he said was, he kind of benefited from that. Is he fit to be president?
I'm sorry, let me qualify a little better. That,
Yeah.
I mentioned the cat and the dog, which of course, but there are people like Bolton that serve with him, and he's a person of the right, and he's quite serious in his job, and he said that it was a horrifying experience to deal with him on national security, and that it would be dangerous, basically, to have him with the button on the nuclear, on the nuclear threat, and so on and so forth. So there is, a major financier that I was talking to the other day said that, he kept telling him, he's quite close to Trump, and telling him, we should do, and he just doesn't listen. He just does things on his own. So I wanted to frame it in that larger context rather than the Biden context, which was more health related. Sorry.
No, I understand. Look, I think you point out John Bolton. I would go even further and say, if you want testament to Donald Trump's character and record, I think it's true. But certainly it's true that there isn't a single Republican presidential, former president, former vice president, former presidential candidate, or former vice presidential candidate who is endorsing Donald Trump, which is an astonishing state of affairs in any political situation. There's at least 7 or 8 people from Dick Cheney, famously, as we know, recently saying he's going to support Kamala Harris, George W. Bush, not endorsing anyone, Mitt Romney. I think he's formally come out in favour of Harris, but I think everybody thinks he is in favour of Harris. Paul Ryan is not a supporter of Donald Trump. Maybe Sarah Palin, actually. She's the one exception. His former vice president, Mike Pence, is obviously not a supporter. So and then I think there's some estimate that 2/3 of all cabinet members who served in his first administration are not supporting him. Of course, that says volumes about Donald Trump's personality and character. I don't dispute. They know him way better than I do, way better than the American people do, and I don't have any reason to think they're wrong. I think there are many things about Donald Trump, about his character that are deplorable and disturbing. And so I think there is question. The only thing I'd say, Mario, is that look at the other side. The other side is, I think you can argue that Trump is a deeply, deeply flawed man. Kamala Harris doesn't have the kind of if you like, characterological problems that Trump has, but I think she is a weak candidate. And I think for a lot of Americans, just talking about this before, look at these two candidates. They looked at Joe Biden and Donald Trump and thought, oh my God, really, is that the best we can do? And now they look at Kamala Harris and Donald Trump and think, is that actually even any better? And I think for a lot of people, they are. Henry Kissinger famously said of the Iran-Iraq war, it's a pity they can't both lose. And I think probably a lot of people still feel that about this presidential election.
No, totally. And it is staggering to be in this situation. The question that I hear from friends in Italy is, but how come America hasn't been able to have better candidates? And the reality is that, as you were saying before, notwithstanding the limits that are clear in Trump, people just vote one side or the other. But so this is another question, because you wrote the book last year that was about America, basically. So how come America is not able to produce a candidate? People say, oh, no, they're both good. And yes, they are the best of the country. can do. And what does this tells us about America, the status of, we're hearing more and more people talking about decline and so on and so forth.
It's a really good question, and I think it's particularly interesting in the current. If you look at the state of the America vis-a-vis the rest of the world, especially from an economic perspective, the United States is doing, as we know, hasn't been a great few years objectively by historical standards, but by relative standards, by standards of the rest of the world. The US economy is doing remarkably well. We've just seen, I was in Europe last week, Mario, we've just seen your namesake, Mario Draghi, bring out his report on how Europe can possibly attempt to catch up with the United States and China, obviously, but the United States far and away the dominant economy. Amazing statistic that since 2014, the US economy has grown in current dollar terms by almost 70%. The EU economy has grown in that time by about 14%. There's some exchange rate is partly responsible for part of that, but there's the real living standards of Americans have grown at a remarkably faster rate than Europeans in the last 20 years, and Europe is getting left behind. So we have this relative success story of the US economy, all the big companies, of course, tech companies being American, companies, leading the way in areas like electronic vehicles, and even in the green space, which, Americans have not been thought of particularly as being particularly enthusiastic or pioneers of green industry, even in those fields. As I say, electric vehicles, so a lot of the underlying technology that's going into a lot of the green investment that's made by American companies. So I think your question is, I say that only just to sort of emphasize doubly how strange it is that even as American entrepreneurship, economic clout, economic genius, the scale of the US economy, America's military and strategic power, which has had some setbacks in the last few years too, but still remains unrivaled. It's pretty astonishing that there is this paucity of political leadership. Why? I think it's partly to do with, maybe it is partly to do with the success of the economy. I think people, successful, bright people in America are inclined to go into business and to make a fortune for themselves, which they can do. And I like the way we're talking about Donald Trump. He obviously is a businessman and parades himself as a businessman, but he wasn't a very successful one. So maybe he sort of reinforces that point that actually the really successful people don't have any particular interest in going into politics. And I think it's maybe partly that. I think it's because over the last 20 years, the toxicity of American politics has been so great, and the polarization so great, that I think talented people who want to get things done, who have a pragmatic approach, who actually want to achieve something, are kind of turned off by it because it's so partisan, it's so unpleasant. The tenor of debate and discussion is so toxic that I think people, again, really kind of talented. It is a self-reinforcing vicious circle, because the more toxic it becomes, the more unpleasant it becomes, the more polarized and partisan it becomes, the more good people are drawn away from it. So I think there's a couple of reasons. There are other reasons too, but I think it is. I would just make the point that it's particularly striking that the quality of political leadership. And let's make one other point too, which is related to that second point, which is, again, there is all of the here I to some extent blame the media. We have a media environment again in which it is all of the incentive structure of the media environment is for people to go to the extremes now. I've seen this myself. I've worked in the media for 30 years in this country, and I've just seen how partisan and mutually hostile it's become. And it creates an environment in which politicians are encouraged to go to the extreme and to be, and we live in an era when, let's face it, we live in an era when the kind of dominant political personalities beyond the presidential level are, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the squad members on the left, and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Probert and Matt Gaetz on the right. And they are not going into politics to get things done. They're going into politics so they can get more follows on social media and they can become bigger figures in the kind of cultural environment in which we live. So I think there's a number of reasons, but I think that captures some of it.
Thank you. So you mentioned the economy. and the economy is very much, of course, part of this election is the key thing. But you also said that the economy is doing well. I mean, unemployment is the lowest since the 60s. Growth has been quite good. Artificial intelligence proved that the US is still ahead technologically. And yet, people are unhappy about the economy. Inflation has played a big role, as we know. So I have three questions. So I start with the first and then the second, and tell you what they are. So the first is, why this unhappiness, and will be the economy decisive? I mean, is it just inflation? I mean, how come, you mentioned the first question that Kamala received, is the country better off now? And it was actually respond. But simply because she didn't want to give a soundbite about that, but then we have the interest rates have been cut just yesterday by 50 basis points, which is very unusual. Was a very aggressive move. So was it politically motivated, you think, or also economically? And then the trade issue, which will require a chapter on its own. Trump wants to put across the board 20% tariffs, 60% on China. From an economic viewpoint, that's a negative. It's a very bad thing. But then there are these other countries that are imposing tariff on the US, and the US has a trade deficit of $1.2 trillion, which is not sustainable. So, economy, on the people vote, on the interest rates and trade.
So on the economy and
why you have 3 minutes.
why people are voting, why people are unhappy with the economy, even though it's doing relatively well. The accent is on relative. Obviously, when people, and the answer to your question is inflation, or more precisely, prices that people feel so unhappy about, in particular that it's price and its effect on real wages. It's no consolation if you're someone who lives in a swing state like Georgia or North Carolina, to go when you go to the supermarket and you see that prices are 20%, 25% higher than they were 3 years ago. It's no consolation that person to say, but in Italy, they're really terribly. They've got their economy is stagnant and it's not performing. Or Britain's a disaster because it's made a complete mess of itself. That doesn't mean anything to people at all. They see prices and they have gone up, but for the most part, wages have not gone up. Wages have just about caught back on average, caught back up with prices over the last 3.5 years. So there's been no real wage increase for people over the last 3.5 years, which is poor performance for the economy. Objectively, historically speaking, again, however relatively good the US may be, in terms of the way people feel about their individual economic circumstances, they feel impoverished, and certainly don't feel that they've had the kind of income gains that they would normally expect to see in a 3 or 4 year period. So that's that. I think the quick answer to that. On the Fed, on interest rates, I don't think it's political at all. I think we knew they were going to cut rates. Inflation has come down a lot. It's very important, obviously, to make a distinction between inflation and prices. Inflation, that is the rate of increase in prices, was at over 9% 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, and it's now come back down below 3%. But prices are still rising. But the Fed raised rates to almost 5.5%, essentially a year ago, when inflation was still close to that. We're still up at 4.5%. Inflation's now come back down, so the Fed has got more space to the inflation. I don't think it's still a little premature to say that inflation has been beaten, but certainly it looks like a much better picture, so the Fed can bring rates down. And I think there's some evidence, and it's picked up a little bit in hints of Jay Powell's press conference yesterday. They are a little concerned about the labour market, that there has been a slowing in job growth in the last few months. Unemployment has gone up by almost a percentage point in the last year. So there's a little bit of gathering concern. And some of the other data you see, the higher frequency data, things like credit cards showing that there's delinquencies are rising, borrowing is starting to decline. There's some evidence, again, I don't think the economy is heading for a recession, but there's pretty clear evidence that it's slowing down. And a 5.5% almost 5.5% federal funds rate was almost certainly too high in those circumstances. So they've started to cut. And on trade, it's interesting that we've gone from a period, Myra, that you and I sort of grew up in and became a journalist, our journalistic career, where we've gone from as a financial journalist, as economic journalists, we've gone from a period when free trade, people believed in free trade. We had after the end of the Cold War, trade exploded. We had the WTO. We had tariffs coming down sort of everywhere. We had this general belief in the economic value of free trade. That period is gone. Obviously, Donald Trump wants to go aggressively further on building on the tariffs that he imposed against China in his first term. Now wants a across-the-board tariff, 10% tariff. He wants to maybe higher on China, 60%. He's talking about 20% on some tariffs. But strikingly, Joe Biden continued the China tariffs. The Democrats, they're not planning to put up tariffs in the way that Trump is, but they're certainly not planning to dismantle the tariffs that are already in place. So I think we've just whether this will change, we've gone from a climate in which we've gone from a climate in which, let's say, there was widespread support for free trade to a climate now in which people favor basically protectionism. They want to protect their domestic industry. And it's not just, to be fair, it's not just the United States either. There's a lot of that pressure, as you know, in Europe and elsewhere too. So I think we've gone from that period of global economic integration, globalization, to a period much, where, again, not dramatically changing, but where certainly further expansion of free trade is very unlikely. And I think there will continue to be, for political reasons, but not just political reasons. I mean, the pandemic brought this home too, right? People want supply chain, want to protect supply chains more. There's a lot of talk about friend-shoring and near-shoring and all of that stuff. Companies want to have much greater security over their supply chain from both political uncertainty and strategic challenges, but also from particular, economic or social challenges that might arise by pandemic. So, once again, Trump is further out on that than his opponents, but I think there is a fairly broad consensus towards, shall we say, kind of deglobalization.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And Biden, not too long ago, I think, has imposed a 100% tariff on the import of electrical vehicles from China. Right. So clearly, the Democratic Party is doing exactly the same. The surprise, in a way, is that the Republican Party, which has always been for free trade, has embraced totally. But again, the social texture has changed completely. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the international scene, because it's a very unstable picture that we have. Ukraine is suffering a lot. Russia is advancing. People say the US did, or the allies did too little too late. We've seen in Israel this amazing attack that left everybody staggered, with thousands of walkie-talkies and message that exploded.
Yeah, I will never again say my phone is blowing up with phone calls.
Yes, yes, exactly. And of course China and Iran, etc. But so let's start with Israel. Just because it hit, I think, something in the imagination of people. It was new, it was unimaginable, it was staggering, amazing from a technological viewpoint. So why do you think Israel did that? What is the meaning of such a new form of attack, which is unheard of?
Look, I'm not an expert on Israel. I'm not an expert on these intelligence matters either. I, talked to some people in the government, as have in the last 48 hours about this, and get a sense of what they're thinking. I think that the answer, Mario, is the demonstration effect. I mean, first of all, there is a certain disabling effect on Hezbollah operatives. I mean, thousands and thousands of them, as it seems, may have been injured or even killed by this. So there's a benefit from that. But of course, they could achieve that by launching a rocket, take out dozens of Hezbollah fighters. I think the point is the demonstration effect, just how extraordinarily sophisticated Israeli intelligence and not but beyond intelligence, Israeli military and sort of quasi-military capabilities are. I mean, for them to have got hold of the supply chain of these, first of all, somehow it's an extraordinary story, as you say, if they did have a role in kind of forcing Hezbollah not to use cell phones because they were so easily hackable and traceable, and so they go to the old-fashioned technique of pages, and then to interrupt the supply chain in Europe or whatever it was to be able to get hold of the pages and put, I mean, that if you're a put it this way, if you're a Hezbollah or a Hamas a fighter or an Iranian terrorist anywhere in the world, it's going to make you think really hard about using any device whatsoever. If the Israelis seem to have this extraordinary capability to insinuate themselves into the network in that way. So I think that's probably the main import of this event. Again, it's less sort of immediately strategically important in terms of the damage it does to Hezbollah's capabilities. But I think just the sense that, and look, that follows on from the extraordinary strike on the the leader, the Hezbollah leader in Lebanon, the extraordinary strike on the Hamas guy in Iran, of all places in Tehran, in a government safe house. I think if you're one of these terrorists, you are going to think carefully. It's going to seriously hamper your ability to communicate, to move around, to achieve some of the things you want to do, and it's going to make you think really hard about whether or not you really actually ultimately have anything like the technical capability the Israelis have.
Thank you. Well, we have Ukraine, but not many developments there, and we don't know that's what the situation is. But I'd like to open the floor to questions. I'm sure that all of you have many different questions about anything, of course. So we are finished.
Going back to your original theme of change, and thinking about Donald Trump in 2016, where he blew away the Republican field, I have this sense that somehow there's a political status quo, which is not MAGA, not Trump, which is embedded in all of Washington and in traditional party mechanisms that actually can't talk to the American people. Even to this day, you have Trump coming up with ideas with Elon Musk Efficiency Commission or whatever, and nothing, as far as I can tell, from the Democrats about what Americans would like to hear.
Yeah.
They want change. The polls say they want change. Why? What is it about the establishment that makes it impossible for them to seriously question the status quo?
No, I agree, Philip, and I think, forgive me, I'm going to promote my own book, which Mario very kindly mentioned I wrote last year. It's called American Breakdown, and it's about the collapse of trust in American institutions, both government and private sector institutions, which has been astonishing in the last 20 years, the decline of trust in the federal government, in the media, in academia, in big business, all of those things. And I think that what you're getting at there is something I think that is a reflection of that lack of trust. I think people have lost trust, and I think the reason, I think the sort of slight tangential answer to your question, but I think the reason is we've had these really terrible events in the US around the world, but in the US in particular in the last 20 years. 9/11, the Iraq War, if you like, followed it, the financial crisis and the Great Recession that followed, and the COVID pandemic. And I think the response of the authorities to all those, rightly or wrongly, you can like it or you can agree or disagree with the policies that were made, these were failures, and there were failures at the government level. And I think what particularly makes this hunger for change so powerful, and maybe gets at why your point about why the institutions themselves, or the people who occupy those institutions themselves can't see this, is because there's been no accountability for them. I think people feel. It was a really interesting, David Rubenstein, who's writing a book based on interviews with former presidents, released an excerpt of his interview with George W. Bush. And Bush talked about the financial crisis, just one of those events, and saying, explaining why he thinks populism really took off after that, and I think he's right. That is that, and he says, I listened to, what happened was, we had this massive, crisis, and the people who were responsible for the crisis got bailed out. Wall Street got bailed out with this massive government subvention, taxpayer money to bail them out, and it really irritated people. And he said, and I was told, Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson told me I had to do it. We had no choice, and I had to do it. And there was no accountability for it. So I think it is those big failures that have not resulted in proper accountability for those involved that makes people particularly untrusting of their government and particularly dissatisfied with their government, and yet somehow the fact that they continue to go on in those positions just reinforces the sense that we don't have an accountable democracy.
Stalin once said that with elections, what matters is not who casts the votes, but who counts the votes. Gerry, do you share Mr. Trump's concern over the integrity of the electoral system?
Will the Palestinians ever get their own state? Edward Said used to say that they're a bunch of crooks. Do you agree with the assessment?
Do you believe that fact-checking is part of this polarization? We have seen fact-checking in the debate acting in one way and not in two ways. Additionally, when is a debate about between two candidates, two opponents, it's not more fairer to leave the other candidate to make her or his job to fact-checking the opponent?
All right, so Noel, on the vote counting thing, look, I think it's a false. I think it's either naive or a deliberate falsehood to pretend that the U.S. voting system is absolutely pure and impeccable. I have no doubt whatsoever that fraudulent activity goes on some scale. Your Stalin quote is a great one. Another great one is the famous mayor of Chicago who supposedly, two actually, but the mayor of Chicago who supposedly, they would always hold the votes back in Cook County to know exactly how many votes the Democrat needed to win the state, and then miraculously somehow the Democrat would win the state with the benefit of the votes. Or John F. Kennedy's father's famous quote about, because there's an allegation, as you well know, about Illinois again, then about Cook County, and Kennedy joked that his father had once said, I paid for the election, but I didn't pay for a landslide. So look, I think stuff goes on, but I think you have to, and I think there are serious questions this time around about, I've seen evidence myself of people who are not citizens being registered to vote. We've had this huge influx of migrants in the last 3 years, and I think there are efforts to get those people to vote, and I think that is going on. But all of that said, directly to your question, do I believe Donald Trump's arguments or claims? Look, I think if you've got these elections are so close that, of course, it does come down to a few thousand votes, and a few thousand votes could be cast fraudulently. But you've got to be able to demonstrate that. And in 2020, with these wild, crazy, nonsense conspiracy theories about Venezuela interfering with the election, with the ballot machines and various other things like that, there was no evidence. There just wasn't the evidence. Georgia was probably the best case example. They had multiple investigations of claims, and they found some fraudulent voted. They found some dead people had voted and all of that, but they did not find any level of fraud on the scale that would have changed the outcome. So I don't believe Trump won the 2020 election. I think that's fraudulent. But I don't doubt that there are, again, in an election the last two elections have been decided by 70,000 votes in 3 states with Hillary Clinton and Trump in 2016, and 45,000 votes in 4 states with Joe Biden in 2020. On that, when it is that close, unfortunately, there is some jiggery pokery that goes on, and I think it's just really important to try and establish the integrity of the ballot beforehand. But no, I don't believe Trump's claims is the simple answer. On the question, will the Palestinians get a state? That's a lot of it. I had some interesting conversations in the last week or two. In the last week or two about with some members of Congress who are involved very much in the whole diplomatic effort. And I think, I'm reluctant to. I'll say this. I was I'm reluctant to say yes because I think this has been something that's been going on for 30 years and there's a high level of skepticism. I think there is a chance that there will be some, before Joe Biden leaves office, that there will be some kind of a deal that they are working on. I know we know for sure right now that would involve some kind of a little bit like the Abraham Accords, a kind of Abraham Accords 2, by which Saudi Arabia would get some things that it wants from the United States, including some additional defense assistance, and by which Israel will get security guarantees from other Arab countries, and there would be, and I'll put it, this is going to sound slightly cynical, so I apologize for putting it in these terms, but one person who is very much involved in these conversations said to me, obviously for the Saudis, a key condition of that deal is Palestinian statehood. And he said what that will mean, what the Israelis will be prepared to accept, but he thinks that the Saudis will be prepared to accept it too. And ultimately the Palestinians will probably have to go along with the Saudis and the other Arabs too. What that means is, as he put it, a flag, a soccer team, and some guns. And if that's the kind of minimal sort of level of Palestinian statehood that they can achieve that would be satisfactory to the Saudis, then I think it might also be acceptable to the Israelis. So again, I'm not saying it's going to happen. I know Biden wants to achieve it before he leaves office. I believe Trump actually also, despite the fact that he would like to get credit for it, would also quite like to have that off the table before if he wins and comes into office. So I think there's a chance. And then the third question was about the media and about sorry, I forget now, what was the next question?
Fact checking.
Oh, fact checking. Look, I mean, I'm very skeptical about fact checking because first of all journalism is fact checking, should be fact checking. I mean, nobody should. That's what we do, right? A very good journalist puts this very well. A guy who used to work for Fox actually, and who left. That's what journalism is. Journalism is about finding out the facts, and when somebody claims something to be true, finding out whether that claim is accurate or not. That should be journalism. I'm very nervous about, because first of all, the fact checking that we see so much of is very one-sided, right? It's like, so as we said, look, perfect example, sort of raised it again, was the debate last week, between Trump and Harris. The moderators repeatedly intervened to correct Trump on facts correctly, as I think on most of them. Although one of them was kind of an observational point. One thing that Trump was fact checked on was, if you remember, he was asked, you said actually you did acknowledge you lost the 2020 election, and Trump said, "Oh, I was being sarcastic." And the moderator intervened and said, "Well, I don't think you were being sarcastic. Actually, I didn't sound like so." That's not fact checking. That's making a critical observation, maybe a fair one, but has no role in a debate. And then Harris repeatedly said things that were true, most notoriously that there are no American troops, no American servicemen and women involved in any combat zones anywhere in the world. Tell that to the special forces operating in Iraq and Syria at the moment, or the naval forces in the Red Sea. That wasn't fact checked. So I think fact checking. It is such a. There are so many complex. Arguments and angles. You can have one set of facts and you can have another set of facts, and they can take you in different directions on the same topic. So journalism should be about, I firmly believe in objective truth, and journalism should always be about trying to get the facts right. I think when we start sort of saying, actually, our job is to be the arbiter here as to who is telling more truth than somebody else, I think that's when you lose people's trust.
Thank you.
Mr. Baker, you dropped a little bomb at the GEI Lunch today. You said that you witnessed people, illegal immigrant or whatever it is, no citizen, that they were registered to vote. This is you.
No,
You.
I haven't witnessed them. I've witnessed documents by Republican lawyers in several key states alleging, with good documents. The documents are available online. You can go and they're doing it in Georgia and North Carolina. No, it's not Giuliani. These are serious people saying that they're citing individual cases of people who've been registered to vote. Again, they're being adjudicated. They're being brought to the authorities in these states, but it is a claim. Frankly, I don't know why you're expressing, incredulity. I find it completely plausible that in the effort to register people to vote, some people who shouldn't be registered are being registered. I think it's completely plausible.
Yeah, we know that people register also in different states, but the point that I would make is that probably it happens on both ends, not just with the Democrats, maybe with the Republicans. So in the end, maybe it's a zero sum. Exactly, maybe in the end it's a wash. Probably that should be pointed out, because I got the impression that you were saying that it was mostly on the Democrats.
I think it probably is, but
but that becomes subjective again, hypothetical, and impossible to.
Well, let me put it this way: I haven't seen any plausible cases of Democrats claiming fraudulent practices by Republicans at this stage of the election. There may well be. I haven't seen anything.
Okay.
When you talk about Kamala Harris, I understand that vice president have never been popular. I mean, I don't know, even Nixon lost his election as a vice president. But she was Attorney General of California, the most important state in the United States. She was a US senator that we all liked when she was senator. She looked very competent. So I still don't understand when people dismiss her as, oh, there is Trump, and there you quoted Kissinger saying, I wish they both lose. Why Kamala Harris is so underestimated? That's what I don't understand.
You seen her answer questions? I mean, did you see her in that interview with the reporter in Pennsylvania last week when she was asked that question? What will you do to bring down prices? And she talked about how she was brought up in a middle-class family. I mean, if you've seen her performances, particularly over the last 4 years when she's been interviewed, I question we can argue about pros and cons. I don't think she was a particularly impressive senator. I don't think she's associated with any legislation. To be fair, she was only in the Senate for a few years, but I don't think she was associated with any particular legislation. She kind of made a bit of a name for herself by going after Trump's nominees on the Supreme Court with things that were, frankly, somewhat dubious. So, I think I'm not, I don't think she has a record of achievement, and I think when you see her interviewed, when you see her unprepared, when you see her speaking off the cuff, I think like a lot of people, I think a lot of people don't find her very impressive. And you're also right that the vice president, it's a very difficult position from which to run. You spend 4 or 8 years, essentially, what's the old joke? The duty of the vice president is to inquire daily into the health of the president and to attend foreign leaders' funerals. That's kind of that is what you do. It is hard to make an impression. It's hard to make an impact. And again, I think it's just evident that she hasn't made much of an impact there. So I'm not saying it's all her own fault or her own weaknesses, but I also would remind you she ran for president in 2019, did absolutely disastrously. She didn't even get to the first primary in she pulled out in 2019 before the first primary votes in the Democratic Party in 2020. Having raised a huge amount of money and having been sort of built up as a real contender, she bombed disastrously. She hasn't won a single primary vote as a candidate, national primary vote, as a candidate in an election in her entire life. And I'm pretty certain, I can't recall there being many other presidential candidates, people who got to the level of being presidential candidate without winning a single primary vote. So I think those are the, again, I think she did a good job at the debate. I don't think she's an idiot. Up against Trump, as I said, would I prefer her and Trump? It's a coin toss in my view. But I don't think she's got a strong record of achievement, either government achievement or political electoral achievement.
Seriously, number one, to what extent foreign affairs, Mario brought up the wars, to what extent foreign affairs are an issue in this election? Will they affect any vote in any of the key states? Question number two, how do you assess the relevance of all the conservatives, many on Wall Street, who detest Trump much more than Democrats, will probably stay home? Some of them will maybe tureranno il naso and go to vote for Kamala. My question is just a few. You mentioned the president. I'm not talking about former president. I'm talking about conservatives who can't stand MAGA. So,
yeah. No, I agree. So on the first point on foreign policy, look, foreign policy rarely matters much in US elections, as we know. After 9/11, it was a big deal, and during the Iraq War in 2004, it's hard to point to them, and probably 68, obviously with Vietnam. Those are the two elections in the last 60, 70 years where foreign policy has loomed really large and been a factor. It obviously isn't looming very large. I do think the one way in which it is, I think Ukraine is obviously out there and the Middle East is out there, and God forbid we get any more, terrible events, especially if some of them, if we would get a terrorist attack on US soil, I think it will become a very big deal in the next 6 weeks or so. I think the way in which maybe foreign policy just is having some impact is I think a lot of people do feel, especially on the right, and I think one of the reasons Trump and the MAGA crowd do quite well, even though I don't share this view, that people feel that all this attention on Ukraine, particularly the money that's been spent on Ukraine, is not appropriate given the domestic challenges that the United States has, given the challenges that the board of the United States has. So I think it's almost like an inverse effect or a kind of negative effect that foreign policy may have in that respect, but I don't think it's going to be a big deal. And on the second point about Wall Street people, it's not just Wall Street people. I mean, it is, as I said, it is former officials. It is a lot of Republicans who will not and cannot bring themselves to vote for Donald Trump, and that is absolutely true. I'll tell you a funny story that someone very senior in the Republican Party, who is charged with trying to raise money from big Wall Street and other donors, big business people who would normally give lots of money to Republicans, are very reluctant to give money to Donald Trump. He told me a story, which is one of the things he says to them is, look, I realize you don't like Donald Trump, I realize you don't approve of him, and I understand, I don't agree, but I understand your concerns. He said, but I'm going to tell you this, you've got to get him elected this year, you've got to help me get him elected this year, otherwise he's going to run again in 2028. If you want to get rid of Donald Trump, the way to get rid of him is to elect him in 2024 so that he's gone for the next, otherwise he'll run again in 2028. If he wins, he'll have dominated our politics for almost 20 years, an unbelievable thing. Look, I think it's fair, and I can't really anybody. It is a striking fact about Donald Trump's personality and character that almost everybody who has ever spent time with him close up to and including even some of his family members, don't trust him. They don't trust him. They don't trust his personality. They don't trust his character. They don't trust him. They certainly don't trust him to run the country. And again, I've spent a bit of time with him, Mike, and I completely understand where they're coming from. So I'm not surprised at all. And again, the terrible question those people just have to ask themselves is, can they, and some of them have already answered that question in the affirmative, can they tolerate the idea of a Kamala Harris presidency with a Democratic Party that will raise taxes and do all the other things that they won't like because they are so alarmed by Donald Trump's personality and character? Can they do that? And they are grappling with that decision right now.
Thank you. Very last. So you said people ask you who's going to win. Now let's go to that. What your gut feeling tells you? Can you tell us that?
Yeah, I think England are going to beat Italy in the World Cup final in New Jersey in 2026. Look, that's a coin toss. It's so close. Yet again, this country. The thing I find extraordinary is not just this country is polarized and highly partisan and with so much mutual hostility, but it's polarized. It's split right down the middle. We have one of my favorite statistics is before 1992, in the 10 presidential elections before 1992, six of those presidential elections, the winning candidate got more than 53% of the vote. Many of those elections, 72, 1984, George H.W. Bush in 1988, LBJ in 1964, a massive landslide. In several cases got 60% of the vote. Since 1992, we've had, I think this will be the 9th election since 1992, no candidate has ever got more than 51% of the vote, 51.5% of the vote. The country is split down the middle, and it's just an extraordinary phenomenon which explains so many of the pathologies and the problems the country has. So it's very close. I think still Trump will win because of what I said right at the beginning, which I think the candidate that can do a better job of persuading people that they represent change. I think the level of dissatisfaction that people have with the country at the moment is high, so high that they will blame the administration, and despite Harris's best efforts, and I think I'll give her some credit, she's doing a pretty good political job so far of kind of evading that responsibility. I don't say that negatively. I think it is quite an impressive political job that she's managing to present herself as new. In the end, I think just enough people will say, it is another 4 years of Biden-Harris, another 8 years potentially of Biden-Harris, and I just don't want that. I want to change. But, the other thing I'll say is I've been wrong about the outcome of, I think, every single presidential election except one in the last 24 years. So.
Thank you.